Welcome to the Multigen Mini Masterclass, where we explore the magic and the challenges of multi-generational living. In this series, we're bringing you podcast-style interviews with real families sharing their stories, lessons, and experiences. Plus, we've got guest experts providing invaluable tips, advice, and practical tools. Our goal? To help you navigate and thrive in this unique lifestyle that's more popular than ever. Whether you're considering going multi-gen or already living it, we want to be your go-to resource for all things multi-generational living. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Multi-Gen Mini Masterclass. Today, we are diving into a side of multi-generational living that I don't think is talked about enough. The realities of caring for aging parents at home. And whether that's from finding the right setup or renovations that need to happen or setting boundaries and communication when there's different styles happening, all of the unexpected stuff that can come with living with aging parents. And today, I think that this episode is going to have so many insights that are going to really help folks, because I know a lot of us are in this position going forward. So I met today's guest, Leanna Pomeroy, several years ago in a women's business group, and we have kind of been following each other peripherally on social media and in the group ever since. She's a powerhouse in business, doing lots of stuff with real estate. She's a lender by trade, also doing some other amazing things that I'll let her share, but someone I've really admired as we've gone. But today we're really diving into beyond the business, which is her experience navigating multi-generational living in a number of different ways over the years and the challenges and the lessons that came with it as she's done this with her aging parents. She is based in Colorado and Florida. She has lived multi-generationally in a number of different ways, first with her mom for better part of a decade and adjusting, renovating homes to accommodate that into separate spaces. And now with her dad, who she has moved across the street from to have some built-in support while also giving him that independence. So she knows firsthand, if anybody does, the rewarding, but also the challenging parts of this journey. And I invited her here today to talk about both the beautiful and the brutally honest parts of this journey. So, Leanna, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. And my mother, let's see, in 2016, 15, I think it was 2015, my mom had ovarian cyst. She lived about an hour away from us. I was living in Denver at the time, and she had an emergency with a physical issue. She called me crying. It was negative something, maybe -5 out. There was an ice storm. I was in Denver and she was living in Longmont at the time, which is about an hour away, maybe 45 minutes on the freeway. And she had called me and she's crying and crying and almost screaming. And my mother was very soft spoken. So,
It's
she didn't
real.
yell. She didn't, it was a big deal. I went, uh-oh, I have to deal with this right now. And we had at the time just recently rescued my now son from, so I didn't have my son. We rescued him out of a bad situation when he was 3.5. So we'd had him for about a year. He needed a lot of care. I had a more than full-time job in the mortgage business. And we were living in this little house in Northwest Denver. And I get this call and I go, uh-oh,
Mm.
and I had zero bandwidth at the time, zero. And I went, oh no, it's starting. And I sort of had this sense that it was coming, right? That she would need my help. And so I got in the car. My husband at the time, stayed with our son, and I drove through this ice storm to pick up my mom. And she's crying and crying. And her surgeon was back in Denver, in Southeast Denver, so even farther than where my house was. And we had to go to her because, that hospital was the only place we could go because they knew what was going on with her. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Oh,
So this became an all night ordeal. Not only that, but my mom is from New York City, hates driving because she learned in New York City, which, was not very
yep.
calming. And so I'm driving, so this was the beginning of it, right? Was me driving through this ice storm, picking her up. She's crying and freaked out, and then putting her in my car, and then driving an hour through an ice storm with my mom trying not to scream the whole time between her pain and her fear of the driving, and spending an hour in the car with her going, Mom, I'm not going to crash, but I might if you can't stop screaming. So that, and she's crying and screaming, right? So it was bad. That was the beginning.
So then you
And in
started
that,
realizing, like, okay, my mom, even if
mhm,
this resolves itself completely, chances are as she gets older and we live so far apart that
mhm,
this cannot become a regular thing
right.
because my bandwidth, we all know you can't just create bandwidth all the time as
Time is the
needed.
only diminishing resource, right?
Right.
So, we can make more money, but I was the only one she felt comfortable with.
Right.
My brother was living in Vale. That was not happening, right? She didn't have 4 hours to wait for him to drive down the mountain in a worse storm, right? I was it. I was the only resource that she trusted. A neighbor was not appropriate. A friend was not, this was not that situation. And so in the course of that experience at the hospital, sitting in the ER for 4 hours, we did laugh. I mean, some of those moments weren't all bad, but that particular hospital at Anschutz, it may be remodeled now, but it looked like something out of a Russian military hospital. And we're sitting in the ER waiting, and I'm going, Mom, couldn't you have gone somewhere prettier? This is awful. Like, we're paying for this. But anyway, that was another aside, right?
So I'm
Best
sure
surgeon
though
for
it
that.
was soon after that though that you started maybe broaching the conversation with
It
her
was that day because we had 4 hours of sitting in
to just
hospital
talk
rooms
about what this.
waiting.
Gotcha.
And
How
I
did she
said,
react?
I'm not doing this again. This isn't working. We're going to have to figure this out. And it took probably 6 months after that. And what we were maybe longer, but I mean, it was that experience that said, okay, no, we need to live together. And she said, honey, I didn't live with my mom for most of my high school years. I lived with my dad because my mom had gotten remarried
Okay.
to someone I didn't love. I mean, he's fine, but so I lived with my dad. So, she looks at me and she goes, honey, we haven't lived together since you were 12. Are you
Which is a
sure?
valid point, I'm sure. And I mean
And
that's
we're
good.
really different. I'm really intense. I'm really type A. I'm outspoken. I'm outrageous. I'm loud. And
Yeah.
she is 100% introvert, tiny little woman who likes to do like arts and crafts and hang out with little kids. And I'm this, I mean, so we're really different. So, and the very first thought was we have to figure out a way. Do we buy a duplex? Do we buy a big house that I can convert a space for? And
That
we
you
were in
needed
North,
two spaces. That was already evident. It sounds like from the beginning. It wasn't considered like moving her into a spare
there was
room.
no way,
Right.
no way. And I will get to that because at the end, we had to do that with her health and it, it was exactly what I expected. So,
Okay.
so that was the kernel. And it took us a while. And at first, we were in Northwest Denver. I tried to find a house that would work. There were a couple, we were also simultaneously trying to get our now son into kindergarten. And he didn't get into the charter school we wanted. And so there were sort of both things playing at the same time, which is often the case, right? I
Yeah.
mean, in this co-housing need, I think, what they call us the sandwich generation, right? We've
Yep.
got kids we're still taking care of, right? You said you have a 13-year-old,
Yep.
right? Mine's now 15. So at the time, he's 4.5. We're looking at the kindergarten thing, going, that's not working. I'm not finding a house that's in the price range I want with enough space that we can both have a separate kitchen, separate bathroom, sound separation.
Right.
My mom is somebody that if play music at like what you would consider barely audible,
It's too
she tells
much.
you that it's so loud it's as if there's like a rock band with loudspeakers in the living room.
Yeah.
So, right, so I knew these things. And so just the concept of it, right, had sent me to these particular kind of avenues. Like, okay, it's either a duplex or
And so
it's a
you
house with
found
a
one though that allowed you to have those separate spaces. And how
mhm.
did once everyone get into their space, how were those early years of living together? Like I know you've mentioned there was some really beautiful stuff about having that setup with your son, with her nearby.
Well, and I was was in a marriage I wasn't in love with, right? It wasn't really
Okay.
working.
Oh
And
my
so I
goodness. So
was
you're throwing in a separation or something as well. Perfect
So when
storm.
we first did it, oh yeah, I mean, layer upon layer of reasons why, and she has still had money. She had a pile of cash. She didn't really have a ton of income, but she had, like you were talking about earlier, right? I mean,
Still
this
independent.
just, yeah, she was extremely independent, very frugal, very careful, had
Yeah.
kept a stash of cash, right? So she wasn't destitute financially. She just didn't have a lot, and she was being careful. And so, which made sense, right? And I was in a position where I made money. My income went up and down. As a mortgage lender, I've had
Yep.
years where I make a huge amount, other years I make almost nothing. But I can make a good living. So it was really, circumstantial more than financial at the time. And one of my mom's things was independence and not wanting to ever end up in managed care. That's something
Right. I
that we
remember you
did
saying that she said, I want to stay at home. Keep me at home.
all the way to the end. She said, please don't ever make me do that. She had tried to do that when her mother needed care, and they ended up, my mom and my stepdad were fortunate enough to not have to. They paid for my grandmother to have in-home
Nice.
care and her own apartment, and they didn't do the co-housing, but that was something she said they had tried it with my grandmother and it lasted, I think, 2 days. And my grandma was so upset at the treatment and the way it went. And that was, the 80s.
Yeah.
So, things have changed. And she just had this image and she said, please don't ever make me do that. So that was already also in the background.
So you already were
And
thinking, okay, whatever we do right now, whether it's for 1 year or 15, there's likely to be a shift at some point
yeah,
where her
yeah.
needs are going to change. And that did come.
And what's interesting is during the period of time that, so my mom had an ovarian cyst the day, during the period when I decided to do it, nothing else. She was super healthy, very independent. She was one of those hippies who ate, what we teased her, nuts and berries.
Yep.
She never did drugs. She never drank alcohol. She never smoked cigarettes. She never smoked weed. Like she was one of those pure,
She's a
back
pure
to the
hippie. It's hard
land,
to be a hippie with that stuff being true.
all of those things.
Okay.
She used to joke when we lived in California in the 70s that everyone thought she was a narc because, they're all partying and
Yep.
smoking weed all day and growing it. And we were the only people that I knew when I was little in Northern California who didn't grow weed. The
Wow.
only ones in the whole community, because my mother said, no way. She didn't do any of that stuff. She was like, I'm not putting that near my kids. That's not, so she was so clean. She walked hours a day. I mean, she was just that person,
She was
right?
healthy then, which is
We've
such a
been eating
blessing.
organic food since since the 60s, back when long before Whole Foods, long before you had yummy, good organic food. I mean, it was gross as a kid. I was
And
like,
what
oof.
happened with her? Like how did the health shift?
So when we were planning this, it was more just, okay, I think it's time. And I knew I was probably not going to be married to my now ex. But we moved together. So we moved out of Denver to Lakewood, which was closer to the mountains for me. So it was a combination of things, right? It was my needs and her needs
Yep.
mostly. And my husband at the time said, yeah, nice house, right? So I found this gorgeous 4,500 square foot suburban house on a hill next to Green Mountain. So I could walk out the door and down the hill and be on a trail. And she had a 1,500 square foot walkout apartment that at the time was just a downstairs. And we added some French doors to close it off. We made the kitchenette more of an actual kitchenette.
Yep.
She had her own fireplace and living room and dining room and bedroom and full bath. I made the bath nicer. It was a shower and she likes tubs. So, I converted that. And that was our first house. And then upstairs was a full 3,500 square foot, 2-story house or
Which is
more,
yeah, which is perfect
3,000
for
square foot
you
house.
and your son and the husband while
Yeah,
he
we
was
had four
there.
bedrooms and the design of the house was great because our bedrooms were on the second story above. There was the living room in between, and then the basement was all hers, and the basement was all walkout. So it wasn't basement at all. It was, so in
Right.
terms of houses for the co-living, it was the best we had
Right. Which I think
in
is,
during
I was
that
just going to say, I
period.
think it's so important. That's been one of our experiences is that that's harder. It's easier said than done to find a house that
Mhm.
it allows itself to be so converted into a perfect space because that's kind of what ours has ended up. It already had a full kitchen, a full separate bathroom,
Mhm.
a full its own
Mhm.
entrance, all those things. It just hadn't been divided within
Mhm.
the building. So the
Yeah.
same sort of thing, because when you have someone like your mom who's so independent and there is no
Mhm.
problem, you know,
Yeah.
they you don't want to take away independence. You don't want to, you just this is
Yeah.
more about, like you said, the convenience and being proactive.
Yeah. So at the beginning, and then so while we were going through the process of getting that house and getting it ready and getting her out of her other house and right, doing the process of moving and cohabitating, she was diagnosed. She started shaking.
Ah,
And so, and she went, oof, right? And she got an early diagnosis from a doctor of Parkinson's. And we think so. She never would take the drugs. She would only do these alternative remedies, but she would do all these protocols. So the first 5 years, 4 years of it, where she was living with me, weren't that bad. I mean, she was able to take her remedies, do a 2 hour walk, do her exercises. I mean, she was just regimented and meticulous with the treatment that she was doing, and it didn't affect her cognitive abilities. She was still pretty fully functional, right? She
yeah.
was my roommate. And she was wonderful. She would pick up my son at school. They would go on adventures together. If I had to work late, they'd hang out, they'd go to dinner. I mean, it was great. And as my marriage fell apart, she was actually really helpful
Of
because she
course.
could witness and say, honey, we were sitting there and everything was fine. And then this is what happened. And this, it was like a force coming in and disrupting the little bubble. And so it gave me perspective. She wasn't awful. I mean, she was nice to my ex-husband, wasn't, she's a very kind person. So, and it dealt with a lot. So she just was like the ground. So for that part was really beautiful. And like some of the photos, I've got others that, I mean, I had like, 50 of that 2-3 year period where she'd pick him up from aftercare and at school, or take him to dinner, or I'd meet them for Mexican food, or for flan
What
at
precious
six
memories
o'clock
for him, because he,
Yeah.
if you had stayed living an hour apart, he wouldn't
Yeah.
have had that experience either. Yes, he would know his grandmother, but
Not
not
like
like
that.
that.
Well, and what's interesting is, the ugly part, the end when it got worse, we've actually talked about, like, remember when mom was really fun? And they go, oh yeah. Because, if he hadn't known that other part as much, he was really grounded in the good part. He
Right,
got to see
right.
her cute and fun and bubbly.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
we
but
lost
then,
my husband's grandfather, we lost to Parkinson's, so I know how ex emotionally exhausting that can be and how incredibly sad.
yeah.
It's tough. That's a tough.
So there's that. I mean, I don't know how far, so that part worked pretty well.
Well,
And
and
I
when her
mean,
needs changed toward the end, you said she then moved into a more of a closer space.
so so we moved. That house was great, but I didn't have a whole community there, so I had looked for, and this is something actually I think is really important to talk about, because and you've said your parents wanted to be in the country or farther away from where you need to be, right? You have a teenager who wants a social life.
Yep.
We bought a house in Lakewood, and it was a gorgeous house and it fit our needs in that way perfectly. There was a charter Montessori school that he could go to, my son went to, so certain things met the criteria. But what I was personally missing was, and ironically now years later, I have all these friends that live within 10 minutes of that old house.
The
But at the
community
time
has
I didn't
been
know
there.
anyone. But I didn't know anyone there now. Yeah, honestly, through the group you and I are met through, I have all these community people now. And I say, oh, I wish I knew when I lived 5 minutes from you.
Yeah.
But at the time, I was going through my own personal stuff and I realized that Boulder was where my community was. And so, Lakewood was half as expensive for a nice, big, gorgeous house with all the other things we needed. And then we moved back to Boulder because I needed community. So I got divorced. I really wanted to have a community, and so I found a house that was much smaller. It was just me, my son, and my mom. And I had flipped a bunch of houses, so I know how to do that. And I found a house that was in the price range and a close in mountain house, stunning little area that worked for all of us. My mother loved it because it was beautiful. She likes quiet and country. My son and I loved it because it was just really cool, right? You're in the mountains, but 5 minutes to town. It was amazing. However, and what we found was a split level ranch where the goal was to have her have the lower half and us have the upper half. It was much smaller. It was like 2,500 square feet, something like that, right? But each of us would have a floor. And so I completely reorganized and designed the entire thing. The house needed a lot of love. So we redid 3 bathrooms, put a
Ugh.
kitchenette in the great room downstairs, right? And excuse me, not only that, but her color choices and mine are opposite. She likes yellows and oranges and warm colors, and I'm all blue and grays, right?
So you
So
have a
I did the paint.
multi-personality house.
Yeah, we're really different. And so I designed the entire spaces, right? So my bathroom was blue tile and, cool tones, and hers was, this pale yellow that I could handle. And right. And at the last minute, she says, we're moving in, we're about to move in. She says, Liana, you have to take the downstairs. I have to be upstairs because my dog will get eaten if he goes out downstairs. And the back is fenced. And so she literally did that.
Ooh.
So that caused that house never worked for us. We were there 3 years, 2 or 3 years
And
because of that, because she basically, and so here I am, divorced, making plenty of money, owning a home in Boulder, right? And she's helping me with stuff, but I'm basically paying for most of it. And I even said a couple times, where I'm out with my friends, oh, my mom's house, blah, blah, blah. It would come out of my mouth. And I go, okay, I bought it, I pay for it.
renovated it. Yeah.
But because she kind of
Yep.
quietly dominated the space, she took my bedroom, which was across from my son's bedroom. And I had even made him like done the bathroom for him in the hall the way that he wanted. He wanted a jetted tub because we had one in the other house. So, I'd done all these things. And then she kind of, but he'll get eaten by mountain lions. And, in the lower level, I had this big expansive space that you really couldn't fence in. It would have been much more expensive. And,
What a difficult
so
milestone, really.
that one didn't really work so well.
Right?
And so my son would end up either sleeping on the couch in the living room on the lower level so he could be close to me, or in my king size bed because he couldn't. My mother would go to bed at 7 p.m. And he's going, I'm all by myself. And he wasn't that old yet. This was a while ago. And he was, there's nobody up here with me. I need you. And so, so it just that household. So that's like, an example of something that really didn't work. And then we looked at, there was a detached garage that I said, well, maybe I could do a studio on top. And we got bids for it. We looked at the cost. And then a friend of mine, had a neighbor who'd been trying to sell a house that needed to be rehabbed and had been sitting for a year that was a lot more similar to the one that we'd had in Lakewood, and called me up and said, hey, I know you guys are trying to find something different or create a different space. We know it's not really working for you the way it is. And so, there's this house and it didn't have a walkout basement. That was the drawback. And it never worked as well as the one in Lakewood.
Gotcha.
But it was otherwise really similar. 3 stories, big, the separation, bedrooms upstairs, living room, basement, bedrooms, and a massive, like, I don't know, at least 1,000 square feet, maybe bigger, just big open room. And it had big egress windows in the basement. So it was
Beautiful.
bright.
Yeah.
Right. And the bedrooms we could have, but never did convert to a walkout. We could have. I mean, it was garden level. So the bedrooms were light and bright. And so I put in a full kitchen in that space for her. So we had two separate spaces. But then before we had moved, my brother died in a snowboarding accident in Vale. And
Sorry.
yeah, so my mom and my dad actually both, right? They haven't been married since 1980, but they both kind of lost it. And that was right as we had already bought the other house to remodel, but hadn't moved yet. And my mother, even when we were in the first house in Boulder in the mountain house, was walking every day, taking all our nutritional supplements, eating at exactly the time she needed, doing stretches, doing the whole, she was taking meticulous care of herself. And her health was getting worse with the Parkinson's, but she was still pretty much maintaining. It had been, I don't know, 5, 6 years, where she's just,
Yep.
okay, I take these supplements, I get 3 good hours. I can go pick up your son at school, but I can't take him to dinner. But it was still pretty involved and pretty active. And then when my brother passed, she couldn't eat, she stopped eating, she stopped being able to do stuff. So her Parkinson's progressed dramatically. And so what happened in the new house was that had she still had, all the autonomy and the ability to function at a full level, that house would have worked great, but had a lot of stairs. And, and she was falling, and we would find her, and she'd say, well, I just need that little alarm. And then we got baby monitors. So we'd hear, it didn't matter if you're falling every single day.
Right. So changes had to come more quickly than you.
And we got home health care. And well, the hardest thing was actually with Parkinson's, and you may know this if you've had family, is it starts affecting your mental health. Yeah. And she started hallucinating. And I had since met my now second husband, and he and his teenagers were there, and he was an amazing help. And the nice thing with the big house was we had room for everybody because we had 5 bedrooms, and but the problem was my mom started having hallucinations, and she would yell at my son and my stepson, they'd be sparring and playing, and as my son would say, I'm giggling, and she's yelling at him that he's hurting me. Right. He'd say, I would be literally like squealing and giggling and laughing. And right. She would go, Leona, he's hurting him. Or, stuff like that, or Andrew went to the bathroom once, and we're sitting in the kitchen, and he goes to run to go pee, and she starts going, he's throwing up. He's so sick. What's going on? I'm really worried. And I'm pretty sure that's not true. I'll ask. Right. So there was a lot of this disruptive stuff going on. And then eventually it got very bad. And so she had begged me to never put her in a home. And so at the end, we actually rented a single-story house. My half brother had come, and he was in law school and he needed an inexpensive place to live. She needed to not go into care. I'm not sure if that was the best decision, but that's how we ended up doing it in the end, is that he then lived with her. And I made her pay a year of rent up front, so he didn't have to deal with whatever happened.
Right. I love through all of this, one of the things that really sticks out to me is your flexibility and fluidity throughout this whole season of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Some folks, especially those of us, and I'm a type A too, and I'm a planner, and we can sometimes, we find the thing, and that's going to be the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be hard to change and go with whatever's needed. But I think that's what you've done really beautifully throughout this season. And it's not easy, because you think, okay, well, I found the perfect setup, but now this thing has happened and I have to, rather than dig your heels in and be like, no, this is the thing. You would move homes, you would renovate another home. Your half brother has now come
Mm-hmm.
to do, and I think that's really cool it can look
We're
like whatever
very,
it needs to look like.
and I think, I mean, so like in my family, right? This is how I've always thought, right? I've always been collaborative. I've always been, my family is really important to me. And even if they drive me crazy, I love them and I want them to be happy and or as best as possible, right? Comfortable. And um in my life, I'm lucky. I'm good at stuff. I can make money. I can recreate houses. I can, find good deals in the marketplace. I'm not afraid of change. I mean, that's like you're saying, right? I don't have that, right? And that helps. It
And
also
it
gets
can
me in
be a
trouble, right?
generational
I mean,
divide too, right? That because I find sometimes, you know, the the boomer generation and the one before them, they were raised to put down roots. They often stayed in the same place
mhm,
a long time or the same house. And each
mhm,
subsequent generation, I find, is a little more open to exploring, traveling,
mhm,
finding
mhm,
ourselves, and I even notice, even with my daughter, and I'm sure you see it with your son, things are evolving so fast. And so while some of us are like, I'm not afraid of change, that's where
mhm.
the magic happens. Some of the
Yeah,
older generations don't always embrace that. And that
yeah.
can be a
And
little bit of a challenge.
yeah, and I think that, I mean, I don't know. Sometimes I think I'm completely crazy, right? I mean, I had this
Same.
gorgeous house. I mean, the last house we lived in, I sold because it was just too much. It was fraught with so between COVID, homeschooling, working 16-hour days, with my mother who's going downhill, with losing all the help and then trying to find people to help. And I mean, it was crazy. And friends of mine would say, "This is gorgeous. It's the most, I did every last inch of that house. I had the blue kitchen I always wanted, like all the things, right?" And friends would say, "Why are you selling?" And I sold in this down market, and I sold for less than I probably could have gotten had I waited till this spring, because now the market
Yep.
seems to be kicking back in. And yet I said, no, emotionally, I need to be done with that period of my life because it was really hard,
Which,
right?
speaking of self-awareness, knowing,
Mm-hmm.
trusting
Yeah.
yourself, knowing in your gut, I know I need to be done with this. I need to turn
Yeah.
the page for whatever reason. I've actually been there, done that, and we won't get into it today, but I relate to that so much. When people, it doesn't make sense on the outside, but that knowing, there's so much to be said for it.
Well, and now I'm in this big expansive, I mean, I've had a flu the past week and I'm like my business is exploding and it's because I think, I gave this period of my life to this process with my mother and I know and that's the other piece I will say is that if, people cohabitate for various reasons, but if it's for your older family members and you feel like that's something that needs to happen for whatever reason, it can be financial, health reasons, just multiple things, right? Like my life, I had many layers of reasons why that was the thing that needed to happen. But it also really, at the end of the day, was an emotional thing for me that, I needed to know that I had done everything I could for my mother. And so that when she passed, I was complete with it. I didn't have any remorse. I didn't feel like, oh my God, I put her in a home and she was
Yeah.
so, I mean, it was really hard. It sucked at the end. It was brutal. She wouldn't listen to anything we would suggest. She just shut down until we couldn't even get in there, right? It was really hard. It was terrible.
And yet
But I
you
mean,
say you would do
parking,
it again.
I would, yeah, absolutely. And I am the thing I think that at the end of the day that is really true for me is that I know I gave everything I could for her. I gave her all the love. I did all the things. And for me, that was needed.
Yep.
And she did help me with things. And, even during that time, she would pay for a house cleaner, she would pay for the internet, she would, right? So we also, for her, because she had a finite amount of cash and she didn't have long-term care, we also knew that, her amount of money wasn't going to last forever if she was paying 5 grand a month or more for managed care. But at the end, we saved a couple $100,000 in cash so that we could have as much home health care as we needed, as much support. And we did, you know, even when she moved in, like with when we ended up putting her in a house with my brother, we paid a year of rent. We got daily home health care. We got, you know, whatever it was. And my brother would call me because I managed the money and he would say, well, can we do this? I say, yes, Alex, that we can pay for. You know, I
Yes.
wasn't going to pay for random things, but I said anything related to supporting her and giving her care is exactly why we have this money. If there's nothing left when she goes, that's okay.
Well, and you bring up a couple good points here that stick out to me. I think as this type of alternative lifestyle really starts taking off in the US, gone are the days where, one of those myths is people only do this when they're financially, there is no other option.
Mm-hmm.
Our family is a perfect example, as yours was too, that it's living multi-generationally that's the priority. It's not the
Mm-hmm.
like you make the rest work, but the
Mm-hmm.
goal is to be together and to make it
Mm-hmm.
look like however it needs to look, and then figure
Yeah.
out how do we make the money work? How do we make the house work? How do we set boundaries? Because the goal is to live together and support one another, and I
Yeah.
know as you're describing that, that's how it is for me. I'm an only child. I have the only grandchild. And so with my parents who are very financially independent, living independent, I mean, we have all gone into this very intentionally. There are no, knock on wood, health problems right now, but we're all aware that we're all aging. And as the only child, I do feel I want them near me. I have to do the things with them to make them,
Mm-hmm.
because I want at the end of the day to do everything I can to make sure that they are happy and loved and cared for indefinitely. And it sounds like you've done a great job doing that too. So let's shift gears just quickly and talk about now you are doing the multi-gen setup in a different way. It looks differently and with your dad.
Yeah. So he's 83 and extremely independent. I
Okay.
mean, he's an old cowboy. So, you know, he thinks he's still 16 and, you know, at 70 was baling hay for a friend of his up in the mountains and complaining about the city slickers who couldn't handle it, who were, you know, 50-year-olds who were like,
Gotcha.
you know. So that's my dad. He's a character. He's fiercely independent. He doesn't have a lot of money. My mother had a lot more money over her lifetime. My father was always working class, you know, has a very limited retirement.
Okay.
And so when my brother passed, my mom was still with us. We were living in Boulder and I was no longer in Denver. My dad had moved to Northwest Denver when I was there to live near me for years. And then after my brother passed, I was in Boulder and he just needed to be closer. And so I found a house in Niwot, where I live now, and miraculously took a while to find it, right? Didn't know quite how I was going to do that. So I found him a house and I bought it as a rental property. He told me he didn't want to own anymore. That was one of his things. So, you know, before even moving across the street from him, I was kind of setting him up to be closer. And as he needed things, his was more emotional, not physical. He's still really tough physically. So we already knew, you know, and he couldn't live with me because my mother was living with me and she
Gotcha.
needed stuff, right? So that wasn't an option. They haven't been married since I was a kid. So they got along fine, but not, you know,
Right.
only for a couple hours at a time. So Thanksgivings, Christmases, you know.
Yeah, that's good. Yep, that's enough.
Um, so that was already happening, right? So my brother passed in this accident and I was dealing with having to take care of both of them as their only child, or my mother had my half brothers, but you know, my dad had
Right.
only me now. And so I found him this house and again, he had limited money, but I'm good at rehab, so I found a great deal, put in, rehabbed it. And here's the other key, and this is another co-housing thing that I did that has saved me. I create it. The house had a pseudo apartment upstairs, but it didn't have a separate entrance. And I looked at different ways. It had a door on the side. And then, we had looked at different ways to separate that space so I could put an apartment upstairs and have somebody either have free or reduced rent to help be there for him when he needed something. You need to go to a doctor's appointment. He
Right.
doesn't like to drive. He can still drive, but he didn't want to. Groceries, make sure he's actually eating. My father never really eats much. He's fine. He's not anorexic, but he's been told. I mean,
Yeah.
I have extra weight. He's never, he's super skinny, old cowboy. So what I did for him, and this is before I moved across the street from him, is I did that. I set up this house that I bought where I added exterior stairs. It had, like a patio, upstairs patio with a slider door. So we just converted that, added stairs. And so it was a separate apartment, locked the door that went to the internal stairs. So put a kitchenette in that space. So we had extra care without always needing me to run over while I'm
Nice.
handling,
Proactive, better than reactive. That's the whole, it's
mhm.
such a big piece.
And so that was another way to solve the same issue, which is I love you. I can't have you live in the same house with me, but I know you want to be independent and you're aging in your 70s already. And, and here we are, he's now in his 80s, and that has saved my butt so many times. And so I charge a few $100s a month rent for what would be, nobody can do that anymore. He
Right.
doesn't need a lot. He needs maybe, hey, could you check on him for groceries? Is he eating? Could you make sure he has, right now he's getting dentures and he's had to go back and forth for 6 months for all these appointments. It's not like it's this major thing, except that I can't leave every day at 12:30 or 1 or whatever time. And the roommate, the upstairs, renter, has a job that's flexible. So 90% of the time,
Wonderful.
they'll call and I can text him and say, hey, can you do this? And he
What a
almost
great
always say,
setup that
right.
for all parties.
And then after I sold the other house, I bought a house across the street. I'm not sure we're going to stick with that because it's driving me crazy a little bit.
Well, what are the odds that the house across the street goes for sale and it's something that you like? What are the
Well,
odds?
it's not, it needed more work than I thought it did. So this may not last, but I did it for that reason, right? Because I don't really want to live with him again. That last stretch of, 8 years was a little rough. And my dad is more stubborn. Also, ironically, likes to play music so loud he sounds like a teenager. And so he's the opposite of my mother, right? He'll
Yep,
listen to
yep.
country, old rock, punk rock. Like, oh, he's a character. But I can't quite have that going all day while I'm trying to work. So
Well, I love that the current setup is you across the street. He's independent. You feel peaceful being able to know that he has the support. That's a perfect note for us to wrap up our conversation. It makes me
yeah.
happy. Let me ask you one last thing. If someone watching this is getting ready to start their own multi-gen journey or they're considering options, what would be one thing that you wish you had known from day one?
I don't even know how to answer that, to be honest.
It's a loaded question. There's so many answers, I know.
I mean, I wish I had known to stand up for myself with my mother more, I think. I don't
Right.
think we would have moved so many times had I had, that second house. I let her kind of run the show because she was fragile. And I thought I tend to be somebody who can just handle it, right? I handle
Right.
anything.
You
I
put
just
yourself on the
deal.
back burner because you can stand
Mhm.
it and you put everyone else before. So
Mhm.
again, that communication and boundaries. Yeah.
That's that, yeah, eldest daughter,
Yeah.
trying to take care of everyone. And yeah, I think that's what I'm doing with my father is saying, hey, okay, like we're considering, flip-flopping and ending up in Florida more than Colorado. And he says, I don't want to go. And I said, Dad, you can keep the house. I don't know how long. This may not work forever, but right now you've got support upstairs. The other piece that I didn't say is that, the downtown Niwot, it's a sweet little town with a huge community. So he has a whole built-in community.
Nice.
And so I don't have to be his emotional entertainment,
The be
right?
all end all. Yes.
He's in his 80s and single, and he's an extrovert. So, that's another piece to really think about, right? My mom was a hermit, he's an extrovert. And so where we are, and you've talked about this, right? Where we are, where we choose to cohabitate with whomever we're choosing to do it with, I think is something that really matters. And I learned boundaries so that I don't do the same thing with my dad. I
So
think that's the
powerful.
thing.
I love how you put that. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming and talking with me today and for
Yeah.
your honesty and showing some of the often kept behind the curtain sides of this, because I don't think anyone should go into any sort of lifestyle not, with blinders on. I think it's
Yeah.
important to talk about these things. And I think a lot of families sometimes choose not to because it can be tough talking about aging parents and making plans for things that aren't here yet. And, I really appreciate you helping me shine lights on these things and sharing your experience. And I would love to have you come back and we do another conversation around what you do for work, which is help people through your lending and through other, because you
Mhm.
work with folks to create similar type setups, whether it's with aging parents, siblings, friends. And I think that is worthy of its own conversation. So if you're up for it,
Thank
I'm
you.
willing to do
Yeah.
that too.
Yeah. I mean, they're very distinct and yet related, because
Sure.
when I do that stuff, I come from my own personal experience. So my heart is along with my strategy and my business sense, right? And
Yeah.
that makes a difference too.
Well,
So
we'll get something on the calendar soon, but thank you so much for today and we'll talk to you soon.
thanks, Erin.